A masked attacker launched a knife at the royal guard, certain he'd make history. But in a flash, the guard moved. And what happened next left the entire crowd in stunned silence. Here's how it unfolded. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The morning mist still clung to the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as Sergeant James Harrington took his position, the ceremonial changing of the guard having concluded minutes earlier. His scarlet tunic caught the first real sunlight of the day, golden rays illuminating centuries of tradition, embodied in every polished button and precise crease. At 28, Harrington stood ramrod straight, his eyes fixed forward with the unwavering discipline that had become second nature after 8 years of military service. While tourists began gathering with their cameras, a figure in a dark coat lingered at the edge of the growing crowd. Unlike the other visitors who moved freely, taking photos and pointing at the magnificent horses in the nearby stables, this person remained unnaturally still, eyes never leaving Harrington's position. The figure's stillness might have gone unnoticed among the sea of movement, but Colonel William Ashford had spent 30 years recognizing threats in war zones across the world. His instincts, honed in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, remained sharp despite his retirement. "Grandpa, why doesn't he move at all?" 7-year-old Thomas asked, tugging at Ashford's sleeve while pointing at Harrington. The colonel knelt beside his grandson, one eye still monitoring the suspicious figure. "Because he's not just wearing a uniform, Thomas. He's carrying the weight of history on his shoulders." His voice was gentle, but carried the authority that had once commanded troops in combat. These guards aren't statues for tourists to pose with. They're active duty soldiers, the best of the best. Harrington's gaze remained forward, but his peripheral vision, sharpened by 2 tours in Helmand Province, had already registered the dark-coated figure. 4 years earlier, a similar stillness had preceded an ambush that claimed 2 of his comrades. The remembrance sent a familiar chill through his spine, though not a muscle in his face betrayed the sensation. "But what if he needs to scratch his nose?" Thomas giggled. "Then he waits until his shift ends," Ashford replied, ruffling the boy's hair while keeping the suspicious figure in his line of sight. "That discipline isn't just for show. In Afghanistan, I saw soldiers like him hold position for hours under sniper fire to protect civilians. The ceremony honors that courage." The dark-coated figure had begun to move now, circling the perimeter of the crowd with deliberate steps. Where other tourists stopped to take photographs or consult guidebooks, this person moved with purpose, studying sightlines and distances. The morning sun caught something metallic briefly as the figure adjusted their coat, a glint that made Colonel Ashford instinctively position himself between the stranger and his grandson. Meanwhile, Harrington's mind flickered briefly to his training officer's words years ago. "The uniform isn't a costume. It's armor against everything that threatens what we stand for." Though his expression remained impassive, his senses heightened as the figure began moving through the crowd toward his position. A young couple approached Harrington, the woman giggling as her partner positioned her for a photograph. "Smile!" the man called out, though he knew the guard wouldn't respond. The flash from their camera momentarily reflected off Harrington's brass buttons, creating a brief halo of light. The suspicious figure paused, watching this interaction with evident distaste before continuing their calculated approach. Now closer, details became clearer. Leather gloves, despite the mild autumn temperature. A scarf pulled high despite the absence of wind, and eyes that studied not just Harrington, but the entire security layout of Horse Guards Parade. Colonel Ashford's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his grandson's shoulder. "Thomas, I think we should move over there for a better view," he said quietly, guiding the boy toward a stone pillar that would provide cover if needed. 30 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct now screamed of impending danger. The dark-coated figure had positioned themselves with a clear line of sight to Harrington, standing at the perfect distance, not close enough to trigger immediate security concerns, but near enough for whatever they had planned. Their right hand remained inside their coat, gripping something unseen as the mourning crowd continued to grow around them, unaware of the tension building in their midst. The autumn breeze carried the sound of distant traffic as the suspicious figure began testing boundaries, taking one step closer to the guard's position, then another. Each movement seemed calculated, gauging reactions from nearby security personnel who remained oblivious to the threat Colonel Ashford had already identified. "Excuse me," Ashford murmured to a passing security officer, his voice low but urgent. "That person in the dark coat. Something's off." The young officer glanced briefly in the indicated direction before offering a practiced smile. "We get all sorts here, sir. Probably just another tourist." "I've seen that behaviour pattern before," Ashford persisted, the medals hidden beneath his civilian jacket giving unseen weight to his words. "In Basra, before and—" "Grandpa, look!" Thomas interrupted, pointing excitedly at the horse guard's stables. The security officer used the distraction to move away, leaving Ashford torn between alerting others and keeping his grandson close. Sergeant Harrington remained motionless, but his military-trained senses had shifted to high alert. The figure's movements followed the precise pattern he'd been warned about in counter-terrorism briefings: the steady testing of perimeters, the calculated positioning, the hand that never left what might be a concealed weapon. His eyes remained forward, his posture perfect, but his mind was mapping escape routes and defensive positions should the threat materialize. An American family stopped nearby, their teenage daughter rolling her eyes as her father consulted a guidebook. "It says here these guards are part of the household cavalry," he announced loudly. "Active duty soldiers, not just ceremonial figures." The suspicious figure had moved closer now, shoulders tense beneath the dark coat. "Active duty protectors of what exactly?" The voice carried a bitter edge that cut through the touristic murmur. "Symbols of colonialism and oppression?" The American father lowered his guidebook, uncertainty crossing his face. Other tourists shifted uncomfortably, the confrontational tone disrupting the reverent atmosphere. "They stand guard over history," a woman with an Australian accent offered. "Tradition has value, mate." "Tradition!" The figure's voice rose, drawing more attention. "Or glorification of empire. These uniforms, these ceremonies, all built on the suffering of others." Colonel Ashford recognized the escalation pattern immediately. The verbal confrontation wasn't spontaneous, but calculated, a distraction technique he'd seen used before hostile actions. He eased Thomas behind the stone pillar, his eyes never leaving the increasingly agitated figure. "Perhaps we should all respect that this is a historical site," an elderly British woman suggested, her tone suggesting the matter should be closed. The figure turned toward her, body language growing more aggressive. "History written by conquerors isn't history at all, it's propaganda, and these guards, just props in the performance." Sergeant Harrington's training in Afghanistan had taught him to recognize the shifting energy of a crowd before violence erupted. Though he remained perfectly still, his muscles coiled imperceptibly beneath his uniform, ready to transition from ceremonial guard to combat soldier in an instant, if required. "You're upsetting people," a middle-aged man in a business suit intervened. "There are children present." "Children should know the truth," the figure countered, voice rising further, "that this uniform, this ceremony, represents centuries of exploitation dressed up as tradition." The crowd began to shift uneasily, parents moving their children back, others reaching for phones, not for photos now, but perhaps to call for assistance. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows as tension stretched longer. Colonel Ashford had positioned himself where he could intercept any direct approach to Harrington while keeping Thomas protected. His military training recognized the pre-attack indicators that civilians often missed: the slightly widened stance, the controlled breathing pattern, the eyes that kept returning to their target between provocative statements. "These guards stand here day after day," the figure continued, addressing the increasingly uncomfortable crowd. "Protecting what? Empty symbols while real injustice continues unchecked." A security officer had finally noticed the disruption and began moving toward the commotion, but Ashford could see he would be too late. The figure's hand, still hidden within the coat, had changed position, no longer simply gripping something, but preparing to deploy it. "It's time someone made a real statement," the figure announced, voice dropping to a dangerous calm that Ashford recognized immediately as the moment before action. "Time to show these symbols aren't untouchable." As if choreographed, the crowd's attention focused on the confrontation, leaving Harrington momentarily forgotten. But the guard's awareness had never wavered. Through his peripheral vision, he tracked every movement, noting the figure's right hand emerging partially from within the coat, revealing a glimpse of what appeared to be dark metal. The morning light caught another metallic flash as the figure's hand began to withdraw fully from the coat, purpose evident in every movement. In one fluid motion, the dark-coated figure pulled down a black balaclava, transforming from provocative tourist to masked assailant. Gasps rippled through the crowd as faces registered the sudden shift from verbal confrontation to imminent violence. The morning light that had moments before seemed so peaceful now illuminated a scene of impending terror. "The world will remember this day," the attacker shouted, voice muffled but clear enough through the mask. With practiced precision, a combat knife emerged from within the coat, not the crude weapon of an opportunist, but the specialized blade of someone who had planned this moment methodically. The serrated edge caught the sunlight, sending reflections dancing across the historic courtyard. Colonel Ashford's military instincts took over instantly. "Down!" he commanded to those nearest him, the battlefield authority in his voice, triggering immediate compliance from tourists who had never experienced combat but recognized the tone of someone who had. He pulled Thomas tight against the stone pillar, shielding the boy's body with his own as the scene unfolded. Time seemed to slow as the attacker's arm drew back, muscles tensing beneath the dark coat. The knife balanced perfectly in their gloved hand for just a moment. The pause before a strike, that experts in combat recognize as the final calculation before release. "For freedom from tyranny!" The words exploded from behind the mask as the attacker's arm snapped forward with trained precision. The knife left their hand in a perfect arc, spinning through the air with deadly purpose, its trajectory aimed directly at Sergeant Harrington's chest. Women screamed, men shouted warnings too late, and children were hustled behind parental bodies as the blade sliced through morning air. The crowd's movements became chaos, bodies pushing backward, tripping over each other in their desperation to escape the unfolding violence, creating a human tide that paradoxically prevented anyone from moving quickly. Harrington saw everything: the knife's rotation, its perfect balance as it spun toward him, the mathematics of its trajectory played out in the milliseconds his combat-trained mind required to calculate interception. His face remained impassive, not from shock, but from the disciplined focus that had kept him alive through firefights in Helmand Province when younger soldiers had frozen. Colonel Ashford watched the knife's path with the experienced eye of someone who had seen such weapons deployed in real combat. For a terrible moment, he saw not the ceremonial grounds of Horse Guards parade, but the dusty streets of Fallujah where similar blades had found targets with devastating effect. His arm tightened around Thomas, turning the boy's face away from what might come next. "Dad, get back!" a woman shrieked, pulling at her elderly father who stood transfixed by the unfolding scene. A teenager stumbled, nearly falling beneath the feet of retreating tourists, before a stranger's hand yanked him upright. Security officers were running now, but distances that seemed insignificant during peaceful ceremonies became chasms when measured against the flight time of a thrown knife. For Sergeant Harrington, the world narrowed to the spinning blade approaching his position. Each rotation of the knife marked the passage of time with mechanical precision, one full turn, then another, the blade alternately catching and reflecting sunlight as it maintained its deadly path. 3 meters away, 2 meters. The knife's tip now aimed directly at his heart as its final rotation brought the blade into perfect striking position. A child's terrified sob cut through the cacophony of screams and shouts, a sound that might have distracted a less disciplined soldier. But Harrington's focus remained absolute, his years of training crystallizing into this moment where ceremony met combat in the historical grounds of Horse Guards Parade. 1 meter. The knife was close enough now that Harrington could see his own reflection distorted in its polished surface. The scarlet tunic, the bearskin cap, the embodiment of centuries of tradition about to be literally cut down for the political statement of a masked attacker. Inches away, the blade seemed to hang suspended for an impossible moment, as if time itself respected the gravity of what was about to occur. The crowd's collective breath held, 100 witnesses frozen between heartbeats as the knife closed the final distance towards Sergeant Harrington's unwavering form. The knife never reached its target. Harrington's hand shot up with lightning speed, white glove flashing in the sunlight as his fingers closed around the knife's handle mid-spin. The movement was so precise, so controlled, that several tourists thought it part of some unknown ceremonial practice, until reality caught up with their perception. The guard, who had stood motionless for hours, moved with the fluid efficiency of a combat veteran. His grip adjusted instantly, securing the weapon while his other hand maintained hold of his ceremonial rifle. Not a single motion was wasted as he pivoted 45 degrees, the exact minimum movement required to face the threat while maintaining his defensive posture. "Security breach! Armed assailant! Southwest corner!" Harrington called out, his voice carrying the practiced calm of battlefield communications. The precision of his words cut through the chaos, directing the approaching security team exactly where attention was needed. The attacker, momentarily frozen in disbelief at the guard's reflexes, suddenly bolted toward the edge of the courtyard. The crowd, still reeling from the knife throw, inadvertently created obstacles as people scattered in all directions. A path began to clear as tourists registered the fleeing assailant, their self-preservation instincts creating a human corridor of fear. Sergeant Harrington moved with controlled urgency, his ceremonial pace replaced by the measured advance of a soldier who had cleared buildings in hostile territory. He maintained his grip on both the captured knife and his rifle, balancing protocol with the immediate security need without sacrificing either. Colonel Ashford, seeing the attacker's escape route developing, made a split-second decision born from decades of battlefield adaptability. "Thomas, stay behind this pillar. Don't move until I come for you," he instructed, his voice leaving no room for questions. The boy nodded, wide-eyed but trusting his grandfather implicitly. As the masked figure reached the edge of the central courtyard, Ashford moved with the surprising agility of a man whose military fitness had never truly abandoned him. He didn't attempt to tackle the assailant. His age made such direct confrontation unwise, but instead extended his foot precisely into the escape path, a technique he'd used in close-quarters combat training for 30 years. The attacker's momentum carried them forward into the perfectly timed obstacle. Their attempt to hurdle Ashford's extended leg failed, sending them sprawling across the cobblestones with a heavy impact that knocked the breath from their lungs. The mask shifted slightly with the fall, revealing a glimpse of youthful skin that contrasted sharply with the calculated violence of their actions. Security personnel converged from multiple directions, their training evident in how they secured the area, rather than all focusing on the fallen attacker. Two officers moved to protect the scattered tourists. Another established a perimeter, while two more approached the assailant with practiced caution, their movements reflecting regular drills for precisely such scenarios. Harrington had already reached the scene, moving with controlled precision rather than reckless speed. His positioning wasn't accidental. He placed himself between the fallen attacker and any potential escape route, his experienced eyes scanning for accomplices or secondary threats that civilians would miss. The knife remained secure in his grip, its deadly purpose neutralized by the same discipline it had sought to destroy. "Secure his hands," Harrington instructed the security officers, his battlefield experience recognizing priorities that their peacetime training might overlook. "Check for additional weapons before moving him." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had given similar orders in situations where lives truly hung in the balance, not just in the controlled environment of training exercises. The security team responded to his authority without question, the ceremonial uniform now carrying the weight of active combat command. Their efficiency in securing the attacker spoke to regular training for precisely such scenarios, preparation the public rarely witnessed, but which occurred regularly behind the pageantry that tourists came to photograph. "Clear the area. Establish a 20-meter perimeter," the security team leader ordered, his own military background evident in his command presence. Tourists were being guided away with urgent but controlled instructions, creating space for the security response to unfold without civilian interference. Parents clutched children's hands tightly, their holiday photographs forgotten as they processed what they had just witnessed, the moment when ceremony transformed into real protection before their eyes. As the attacker was brought to their feet, now securely restrained, the balaclava was carefully removed by one of the security officers. A collective gasp rippled through those witnesses, still close enough to see the revealed face, not because of who the attacker was, but because of how ordinary they appeared. A young man in his 20s, his expression a mixture of rage and shock, looked nothing like the monster his actions had suggested. His eyes, darting between the guards who held him and the knife that Harrington still held, showed the first flickers of realization that his plan had failed completely. Colonel Ashford had retrieved his grandson and now stood at a safe distance, his arm protectively around the boy's shoulders. His eyes met Harrington's briefly across the courtyard, a silent exchange between soldiers who understood that civilian safety had been preserved not by luck, but by the vigilance their training had ingrained. Thomas looked up at his grandfather with new understanding, witnessing firsthand how the military principles Ashford had described were more than just stories. The knife, now secured in an evidence bag by security personnel, had come within inches of changing a ceremonial guard's position into a crime scene. Instead, it had become evidence of how thin the line sometimes stands between ceremony and combat, between tradition and the skills that preserve it. "Did you really think we're just statues?" Harrington's voice carried quiet authority as he stood before the secured attacker. Though he had resumed a formal military stance, there was nothing ceremonial in his eyes now. They held the focused intensity of a soldier who had faced death in Afghanistan's contested valleys. "That these uniforms are just for show?" The young man's defiance hadn't diminished despite his capture. "You're dressed like a relic from another century while protecting symbols of oppression," he spat, straining against the restraints. "Playing soldier for tourists while real injustice goes unchallenged." "Playing soldier?" For the first time, emotion coloured Harrington's voice. Not anger, but a deeper disappointment. "This uniform has been soaked with the blood of real soldiers on battlefields across the world. Men I served with. Men who died wearing it." His hand unconsciously touched the campaign ribbons on his chest, each one representing operations where ceremonial tradition had given way to combat reality. Security personnel had established a protective cordon, keeping remaining onlookers at a safe distance while evidence was being catalogued. The knife lay on a nearby table, its deadly purpose now neutralized, transformed from weapon to exhibit in what would soon become a serious criminal investigation. Colonel Ashford approached, having ensured his grandson was safely with a female security officer who was distracting the boy with questions about his favorite superheroes. "I saw your throw," he said to the attacker, professional assessment in his tone. "Military training." The young man's momentary surprise confirmed Ashford's suspicion before he could mask it with renewed defiance. 6 months before I realized what I was really defending. Then you should know better than most what that uniform actually represents, Ashford replied, gesturing toward Harrington. I commanded men like him for 30 years. That ceremonial guard caught your knife because before standing on these grounds, he stood on battlefields where similar weapons weren't thrown for political statements, but to kill. Ashford's voice carried the weight of someone who had written too many letters to families of fallen soldiers, letters explaining that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the politics that often surrounded military service. Your wars don't justify, the attacker began, but Harrington cut him off with a precision that matched his earlier movements. This isn't about justifying wars. Harrington's posture remained regulation perfect even in confrontation. It's about understanding what you attacked today. Not monarchy, not symbols, but the unbroken line of service that connects every soldier who's ever stood guard over this nation. His eyes held the attackers without wavering. The same discipline that allowed me to catch your knife is what keeps me standing at attention for hours. The same training that taught me to spot threats in a crowded Afghan marketplace is what helped me identify you before you revealed yourself. The young man glared, unmoved by this explanation. Pretty speeches don't change what these institutions represent. No, Harrington agreed, surprising the attacker with his response. Speeches don't change history, but neither does violence against those who serve. He moved closer, close enough that the attacker could see the campaign ribbons on his chest, each one earned in combat operations the public rarely heard about. You see pageantry? I see brothers and sisters who've bled beneath this uniform in defense of the very freedoms that allow you to question it. A small crowd had remained, despite security efforts to clear the area, their phones long forgotten as they witnessed this exchange between attacker and defender. Among them, a school group that had arrived just after the incident stood in stunned silence, their teacher using this unexpected moment as a lesson far more powerful than any planned tour could have provided. Police officers had arrived now, their distinctive uniforms creating a second perimeter around the scene. One approached with handcuffs, ready to take custody of the attacker from the security team. The young man's expression remained defiant, his ideology unchanged by his failure or capture. His eyes still burned with the conviction that had driven him to violence, seemingly untouched by the reality of what had transpired. The knife was aimed at what this uniform represents, the attacker declared, raising his voice as if addressing not just those present, but some imagined audience beyond. The system it protects needs to fall. Yet you aimed at a human being, Colonel Ashford observed quietly. Someone's son, perhaps someone's father, certainly someone's comrade. His eyes held the weight of having lost men under his command. That's the reality your ideology conveniently ignores, that symbols are embodied by people, and attacking them means attacking flesh and blood, not just concepts. As police officers began reading the attacker his rights, preparing to lead him away, Harrington spoke one final time. Whatever message you hoped to send died the moment that knife left your hand. What people will remember instead is that the traditions you despise produced the reflexes that stopped it. He straightened his uniform with practiced precision. The same traditions that ensure I'll be back at my post tomorrow, standing guard regardless of today's events. The crowd had begun applauding, not the polite appreciation of tourists witnessing a changing of the guard, but the genuine recognition of courage displayed when ceremony gave way to real-world threat. Their clapping built into a spontaneous ovation that spread across the courtyard. echoing off the historic walls of Horse Guards Parade. Some tourists who had fled during the attack had cautiously returned, piecing together what had happened through whispered conversations with those who had witnessed the entire scene. Harrington acknowledged neither the applause nor the continuing glare of the attacker as he was led away by police. Instead, with precision that spoke of unwavering discipline, he returned to his guard position, the same spot he had occupied when the morning began, before violence had attempted to disrupt centuries of tradition. His white gloves, momentarily employed in combat, returned to their ceremonial position. His eyes, which had tracked a threat with battlefield precision, resumed their forward gaze. The morning sun, higher now, cast different shadows across Horse Guards Parade, but Harrington's silhouette remained unchanged, the living embodiment of duty that continued regardless of threat or recognition. Colonel Ashford collected his wide-eyed grandson, whose understanding of the guards he had come to see had been forever transformed. "That, Thomas," he said quietly, "is what it really means to stand guard." The boy nodded solemnly, his earlier questions about why the guards didn't move replaced by a deeper comprehension that sometimes stillness contained its own form of strength, the readiness to act when duty called, regardless of whether that call came on a battlefield or a tourist attraction. Sergeant James Harrington remained at his post as the crowd gradually dispersed, tourists returning to their sightseeing with stories far different from what they had expected to take home. The knife that had spun through the morning air was gone now, secured as evidence, but what remained was more powerful, the unbroken tradition of service that had produced the hand fast enough to catch it. What does it truly mean to stand guard? Today, we witnessed how centuries of tradition, discipline, and real combat experience converge in the ceremonial uniforms that many mistake for mere tourist attractions. The Royal Guards represent something beyond pageantry. They embody the unwavering commitment to duty that protects everything we value. When that knife spun through the air, it wasn't just testing one guard's reflexes. It was challenging the very principles of service and sacrifice that form the foundation of our societies. The blade never reached its target because true guardianship goes deeper than ceremony. It's forged in training grounds and battlefields long before it stands watch at historical sites. What would you have done in Sergeant Harrington's position? How prepared are we to defend the traditions and values we claim to cherish when they're literally under attack? Perhaps more importantly, do we truly understand the depth of commitment behind the ceremonial facades we so often take for granted? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful reminders of what true service means in today's world. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload new content. And do check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now, and we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video.